for the last 50 or 60 years, where it's been degrading the soil with increasing levels of man-made inputs and monocultures. And there's a big need for regenerative agriculture right now to try to fix that. And that's why the certification seal came about, because we wanted to be able to put that on pack so that consumer could look at that and know that that seal is grounded in truth and traceability, that they don't have to do the research to work out where that meat comes from. They know that that seal is something that they can trust because it's grounded in facts and truth and in traceability. Over the last 5 years, 75 farms per day have gone out of business.
Welcome to Farm to Fork, the Innovators. I'm your host, David Maloney, president of Datum FS. With over 40 years in the food supply chain, we explore the stories and strategies that are transforming how we produce and serve food. Our guest innovator today is Richard Tufton, vice president of supply chain for Pastured Protein for Regenified, a leader in regenerative and climate-positive food production. We'll dive into regenerative agriculture's impact on farmers, consumers, and the planet, how major chains like Shake Shack and Chipotle are embracing it, using regenerative products to connect with consumers, and the future of agriculture and our planet. Hint, it involves cows. So buckle up, hit that subscribe button, and let's harvest progress together. This is Farm to Fork, the Innovators, where the future of the food supply chain starts with this episode. All right, Richard, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you very much for having me, David. So my name is Richard Tufton, and I am the vice president of supply chain for Pastured Proteins for a company called Regenified. And I'm a Brit living in Austin, Texas, so I speak a little bit differently. And I spent the first, 12, 13 years of my career over in the UK. And I've been here in Austin for 9 years. So I'm still getting used to the culture and words like trunk and soccer. But that's a very brief bit about me. I've got a couple of kids, both born over here. I actually got naturalized a few years ago. So I'm a US, UK dual citizen.
Great. Okay, great. And so any hobbies?
I spend most of my time being dad taxi. That's my biggest hobby right now, driving the kids around. But yeah, I'm a big fan of soccer, so I play quite a lot of soccer. Any sports, really, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So Copa America or Euros?
Well, I do like everything. I'm still learning about the MLS and trying to get enthusiastic about that. Here in Austin, we recently got an Austin FC MLS team, which has been quite fun to get stuck into that. And it makes it much more accessible. A really good stadium here in Austin. But yeah, I like all football. It's a global game. World Cup, Copa America, Euros. Although definitely England still has my heart in those international games.
Sure. All right. So tell us, we're going to jump into Regenified here in a second, but in a few sentences, kind of share with us, what does Regenified do?
Sure. Well, Regenified was created by 3 farmers with an aim of protecting the narrative over regenerative agriculture. And that word has definitely become more and more trendy, and more brands and products are starting to use that word to sell their product as being better than the other competitors. And so it was a way to try to protect any kind of greenwashing, so that method of raising the food, whatever it is, has a standard that can be policed by a third party such as ourselves.
And so Regenified has a label, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So it's a certification. So it's a seal that you'll start to see more and more on pack of products, any product that comes from soil. So it's not just meat, which is the area that I'm in, but it's also things like coffee, tequila, Maker's Mark, bourbon. It's all different kinds of products which come from soil, crops too. And also forestry. So anything that grows from soil is what we're interested in, trying to put the soil first.
Yeah. And so, folks, if you follow the podcast, maybe about a month or so ago, we interviewed Austin Allred with Royal Family Farming out of Washington State. We did an episode on regenerative agriculture. But in case you have not, you don't know what regenerative agriculture is, Richard, can you kind of define it for us, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are lots of different definitions out there, but really the core belief is that we want to be able to leave the soil better off than it was before you grew whatever it is that you're growing. That's it in a nutshell. And so it's about promoting a farming style which puts energy from the sun and rainfall into that soil to help promote and leave it in a better situation than it was before you harvested. And unfortunately, that is the polar opposite of what we've become very good at doing as a nation, as the globe as well, for the last 50 or 60 years, where it's been degrading the soil with increasing levels of man-made inputs and monocultures. And there's a big need for regenerative agriculture right now to try to fix that.
Yeah. And so before we jump into this, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most important, how important is our soil health to the health of the planet?
I mean, 25, 50. Right. It's extremely, extremely important.
Yeah.
And it's all, there's a lot of confusion out there. I think governments, boardrooms all understand that we have to change the way that we're doing things. And food is a big part of that equation. And within the food equation, regenerative agriculture is not only one of the answers, it is the answer to help us get out of this mess and leave this planet in a place that's positive for our children and their children. And that's, it's very, very possible and easy to capture 4 times as much carbon as you're using whilst you're growing cattle, for example. Most people think of cows and they probably think, oh yeah, they're one of the main causes of climate change. Well, it's very possible and easy to completely reverse that. And it's all about the way that you're raising them.
So and I want to get back to how you kind of got to Regenified, and we're going to talk a lot about Regenified, but I want to address the people out there that are saying, oh no, right? I mean, yeah, I hear about it. I get it, but it's too expensive for my operation. It can't be done at scale. And folks, that's not the case. Right? That's not the case. It is being done at scale, at some scale, if you start to listen to Austin Allred and other people. And I would offer that not only for the health of our planet, but for the health of your restaurant or your grocery store, and the connection that you can make with your consumers through this is extremely important. Extremely important.
Well, I mean, let's start at on the farm, right? If you can become a good farmer using regenerative practices, you can significantly save the input costs required to produce whatever food it is that you're producing. You know, we've got a farmer who's certified Regenified in Kansas. He's a crop farmer, and he's worked out that he can save about $2.70 per acre on producing his crops since becoming a regenerative farmer. And he's got 10,000 acres. So do the maths on that and tell me how much better off he is every year. It's actually amazing how much more profitable farmers can be if they farm this way, because the focus has to shift from farming for yield and actually focus on farming for profit. So we're working with farmers and producers to really reduce those input costs to produce the food. And it just happens to go hand in hand with food that is much more healthy for you to eat as a human at the end of that process. And it goes hand in hand with making that farm much more resilient than what it was before. Obviously, we're living in a time with hurricanes and flooding and drought and all these extreme situations, which are things that farmers can't directly control. But if they farm in this way, they protect their land and their livelihood and give themselves a much better chance of getting through those events. I mean, I'll give you one small stat, which is the average farmer in the US can infiltrate about half an inch of water per hour. Infiltrate is when rain falls on land, whether that water infiltrates, i.e., soaks into the land, or does it go sideways? Does it wash out into the rivers and streams? So the average farmer in the US, it's about half an inch an hour. And that was Gabe Brown, who is one of the founders of Regenified. His farm, when he first started, was that. And now he's got that up to 32 inches of rainfall per hour. Now, his farm's in North Dakota, which has an average annual rainfall of about 8 inches or something. So he could infiltrate way more. But what's interesting about that is you think about hurricanes that bring in 25 inches of rain in a day or two. And if all the farms were regenerative farms, well, that water would all soak into the soil and be stored there, ready to help that farmer grow more crops. But instead, what happens is it's coming down at the rate of 25 inches, and they can only infiltrate half an inch. So 24 and a half of those inches goes sideways into the rivers and streams and causes catastrophes. So, I mean, that's just a small aspect of regenerative agriculture and some of the good that it can do.
And so, Regenified, if I can oversimplify this, if you're a consumer today, and I think generally the consumer at the grocery store is confused, whether it's organic, all natural, cage-free, pasture-raised, whatever it may be. As a matter of fact, I was in, I won't name names, but a very high-end grocery store recently, and their beef was pasture-raised, right?
Yeah.
Well, all cattle at some point are pasture raised. So I asked them personally, I said, are these fully pasture raised cattle or do they go to feedlots? And the answer was no, they go to feedlots, but they're still marketing them as pasture raised. So I think the consumer's confused. And that's where Regenified kind of steps in because Regenified, it makes it simple where that's that label there. It's met that certification and consumer says, okay, I'm making the right choice here, or I have an opportunity to make that. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's very fair. And let's think about the statement I said earlier that a lot of consumers think of cows and cattle as a big contributor to climate change. And that isn't an incorrect statement because most cattle, well, every animal on this planet spends 2/3 of its life out on pasture, and that's great. But then they get to this fork in the road where a lot of cattle then go into a feedlot. And a feedlot, just to explain, is if you picture in your mind's eye a gigantic car parking lot full of cattle. They're not on pasture or grass, they're just on dirt, and they get fed by these big 18-wheelers that pass along the side of the bunks that the cattle are eating in. But at that point, when the animal enters the feedlot, the good that it's doing to the environment stops. And at that point, they're eating a lot of food very quickly and they're belching out of their mouths enteric methane. Enteric just means it's coming from their stomachs. And that is contributing very negatively to climate change. But by keeping those animals out on pasture for the full life of the animal, you can really mitigate all of that. And as I mentioned, like 4x carbon saving is possible with a system like that. And another point I want to make is, you think about how many head of cattle are being killed here in the US. It's somewhere in the region of about 29 to 30 million head of cattle per year. Well, if you look at the grassland that we've got here in the States, we actually have capacity to finish on grass about 50 million head per year. So we can do this. We've got the capacity in terms of the land and the land use to finish cattle on pasture. But it's going to require a lot of education and podcasts like this to help people understand why that's important. And why that's important is, for one, it's going to make the soil and the land much better than it is today, which is going to really help to draw down all of these problematic gases that are in the atmosphere that really should be in the soil. And two, it's going to be able to produce very nutrient dense food to feed a growing population. So we can do this. It's very possible.
I mean, essentially, we need to create that flywheel. And many people would say, well, wait a minute now. The cows are the problem, but it's not the cows. It's how we're using the animals is the problem. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a very good documentary called Roots So Deep. I don't know if you're aware of that or your listeners are. If not, go look it up. It's rootsodeep.org is how you can stream it. And the point of that documentary was looking at pairs of farms, 5 pairs of farms in the southeast of the US. And it was a 5-year study. And they looked on one side of the fence line was traditional cattle raised on pasture. They could roam wherever they wanted on the property. And that property was treated with fertilizers and herbicides and all the different sides that get used in production of agriculture. On the other side of the fence line was adaptive multi-paddock grazing, this idea of heavy hit and rest. So the cattle were kept quite bunched up. And then with the use of electric fences, they were moved once a day across the whole property. So every piece of pasture gets grazed very heavily and then gets rested. And I won't spoil the results of the documentary, but it wasn't even close, the comparison. So to answer your question, it's the how that's very important, but it's also very simple and very easy. But it requires a big re-education of farmers and just an understanding that agriculture. I mean, I went to university 25 years ago, to college over in the UK, and I studied agriculture. And essentially what I was taught for my whole degree was, if you want to get into farming, the equation is this: you put chemicals in, you get yield out. The more chemicals you put in, the more yield you get out. And that's how farming works. But what we're increasingly learning is that it's not a chemistry equation, it's a biological equation. And if you can feed those biological processes, which PS cost way less money, because all you're doing is you're utilizing the sunshine and the rainfall. And if you can do that, you can produce food which is way more nutrient dense. And, we can come on to this later if you like, but look at things like, if you eat an orange today, it equals something like, you'd have to eat 4 oranges today to get the same minerals and vitamins compared to 1 orange that our grandparents would have eaten in the 1950s. Like, food is becoming less and less nutrient dense, and that's all thanks to the way that we're producing it. And PS, I'm not suggesting that farmers are the bad guys here. Farmers have always done what we've asked them to do. And what we've asked them to do for the last 50 years is to smash yield targets, produce as much as you possibly can. And that's come at the expense of the soil. It's come at the expense of the nutrient density. And now we're starting to realize that. And you have a look at the health of people here in the States, and the amount that we spend every year on healthcare exceeds the amount that we spend on food. And things like that are now starting to be realized and causing people to wake up and think, well, actually, maybe we should be doing this differently.
Yeah. So I think that it's important that people understand that over the last 50, 60 years, the idea was to get food secure in the United States. Right.
Absolutely.
And this was the plan to get food secure. So I don't think anybody purposely did anything malicious. They just didn't understand where we were going. And the pendulum has probably swung too far. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the trouble is that finishing cattle in a feedlot, finishing means the length of time it takes to get from birth to slaughter. If you finish an animal in a feedlot, you can get them ready for slaughter at a much younger age. And if you do that, then the farmer gets paid quicker, the money flows quicker. And that's a big incentive for that system to work. And it's also a way to produce food, in theory, that's much cheaper. But then what is the true cost of that food? And the trouble is that part of that cost, a big part of that cost, is the land becoming degraded and degraded and degraded. And so then we start to feel some of the side effects of that, which really we don't want, i.e. the climate getting warmer, having more severe weather events, and increasingly losing the nutrient density of our food.
And so can you give us a quick example of regenerative agriculture? Somebody may not fully understand it. But generally what we, if I understand correctly, we don't want to overburden the land that we're working, and we're working towards soil health. And for example, the manure that comes from these animals, or the waste that comes from these animals, are very important to the soil, right?
Absolutely. Well, you think of soil as a whole network, a whole city of microbes that are under our feet. And there's something crazy like in a teaspoon of soil, there are more microbes in that teaspoon than there are human beings on this planet. And for those microbes to survive and thrive, they need this network of mitochondria. If you think of it as kind of highways and tunnels deep inside the soil, connecting it all together. And so in order to become a regenerative farmer, what we encourage are practices like do not disturb the soil. We don't want it to be plowed up and turned up down with agricultural machinery. We want it to be left. So, for example, if you're a crop farmer and traditionally you plant your you plant your field of corn, the corn grows, you come across it in your combine harvester, and then the next step is that you plow that field, meaning you turn the soil upside down. So you bury what's left of the crop. But in doing so, you're destroying all of these underground pathways, which you want, because that is going to make your soil more resilient. So instead, we encourage no-till, which means no plowing. So you would maybe plant your field with two different types of crop. One would grow very quickly, and that would be the corn, which you'd combine. But then you'd plant a cover crop at the same time, so that once the combine has passed through, there's still green stuff underneath, and that green stuff is still photosynthesizing, which means taking energy from the sun and carbon dioxide from the air and putting that into the soil. And then with that cover crop, well, maybe you have some cattle on your ranch or some sheep, and then you can graze them through on that. And it's about keeping that cycle going and really compounding the number of things that you can grow per acre of your land in any given year. And it's about diversity. Trying, if you're a cattle farmer and you have pastures, instead of having one species of grass, have 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 species of grass and green stuff that the cattle can eat in your pasture. You have some shallow rooted stuff, some deep rooted stuff, because that's all going to help with the soil structure. And I mean, it's interesting, a perfect soil should be about 60% air. Think about that. That's pretty crazy to think about. And that's all the structure built by the microorganisms that live under there. And if you can get a soil to have much more air within it, then guess what? When it rains heavily, you're going to capture all of that rainfall. So really, it doesn't matter as a farmer how much rain you receive or don't receive. It's about how much you can save. And things like that are really important. I don't know if you're familiar with a book called Dirt to Soil, which was written by Gabe Brown. And it runs through his actual story of how he went from a conventional farmer to a regenerative farmer. But he often talks about, I've asked him a number of times, this is great, but is it scalable? Can you feed the world? And his answer is, let's say my neighbor and I grow the same field of corn and we yield about the same amount. Well, that's great. But then guess what? My neighbor is then plowing his land and it's going to be brown for then the next 4 or 5 months until the next year's crop goes in. But on Gabe's farm, he then puts his cattle through and he puts his pigs through, and his laying chickens will go through on a mobile coop, and he has bees there that give him honey. And so he has all these different revenue streams kind of compounded on top. So you tell me who's going to feed the world first.
All right. So let's get to Regenified.
Sure.
Why is all this? What's the most important reason to do all this? And it sounds like there's no one practice for regenerative agriculture. Seems like there's lots of practices, right? And maybe some of the things that strike me is that it is some key things are letting the soil rest and recover, right? Mm-hmm. Having variety of opportunities and crops. So Austin Allred would talk about his family farms, I think 10,000 acres of potatoes or 5,000 acres, but only 1,000 of those acres actually have potatoes on them every year. And the rest is like exactly so. You can say, well, more nutrient dense food, better for the planet, better for the soil. Let's say, well, we can get around all this if we just get rid of meat. Like, how do you answer that?
I know for a fact that cattle are the catalyst in any regenerative system. You don't have to have livestock on your farm to become a regenerative farmer. But if you do, and you're able to use them to disrupt the regular cycles of plants growing, you can really expedite that whole process. And so, do I think people should be eating meat every single meal? No. I think you should definitely focus on understanding where your meat comes from and making sure it comes from a regenerative farm. Because if you do that, they can really significantly boost the health of your local ecosystem on your farm in your context. And really, that's the point of, you talked about all this confusion if you're from the point of view of a consumer deciding what to buy. And that's why the certification seal came about, because we wanted to be able to put that on pack so that consumer could look at that and know that that seal is grounded in truth and traceability, that they don't have to do the research to work out where that meat comes from. They know that that seal is something that they can trust because it's grounded in facts and truth and in traceability. And they also know that it's going to be more nutrient dense than the other food around it. I mean, I'll give you another little example. We've got a rice grower who's up in Arkansas, and we nutrient density test all of the farmers that are in our network. We give them nutrient density testing, and it gets run through an amazing guy called Stefan Van Vliet at the University of Utah. And he puts it through a mass spectrometer, which measures about 3,000 phytonutrients and chemicals. And that tells you the exact makeup of the food. Now, this rice farmer, on his cup of rice, he is able to state on his label that it gives you 11 grams of protein per cup, whereas most rice out there gives you 9 grams of protein per cup. So that extra 2 grams, that goes on the label alongside the Regenified seal, so that all of his customers who pick up that pack of rice know that they're getting something that is going to fill them up, that's going to nourish their bodies, and is a reason to pick that up off the shelf, which in turn pulls everything through the supply chain. And I know for a fact that that demand exists, because I think more than ever, the way that food is grown is at least visible if you want it to be. There are now more documentaries and things on YouTube and articles. There's a reason why a lot of feedlots are hidden away in the middle of nowhere, because they're not pleasant places. And I think it's really useful to educate yourself and learn about where your food comes from, how it's grown, because it does make a big difference, not just to the planet, but to you and the health of the human that's eating it, whether it's the rice, the meat, the bread.
So back to Regenified. Regenified kind of certifies that farm. So you have a group of farms that you certify, and by certification, then they're able to use your label, okay, or your or use your logo on their label, right?
That's right.
So what, and so that's sounds like Regenified is an education, right? Is it educate? I mean, you're educating the farmers. You are, I would assume, it's a network of these farmers of best practices. That's right. And then you're creating this label to make it easier for consumers to make a more purposeful choice in their food. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's right. So the farmer itself who gets verified pays a verification fee. So we come and visit that farm once a year, and we do all of the poking and prodding and testing and observing to work out where they are on their journey. And the unique thing about Regenified is that it's not a bar that you have to get over to become classed as regenerative. I want you to kind of think of it like an on-ramp. And so it doesn't matter if you're right at the start of your journey or if you've been doing it for 30 years. We have a tiered structure where tier 1 is you're right at the start of your journey, all the way up to tier 5, meaning you've been doing it for a long time and you're really good. Over the course of the verification, we take 65 data points per field, per farm. And the big thing that gives the farmer is knowledge. You can only manage what you know. And so that's giving the farmer much more information than they've ever had before, so they can start to make better management decisions on how they grow their crop or their cattle. And they can start to experiment with different things to try to make better use of the sunshine and the rainfall. So that's the process of the farm getting verified. And that's an annual verification. As long as you're tier 2 or greater, then your product can go into the seal. That's the level of that. So that cost of verification is for the farm and all of the products on that farm. And as you work your way through the supply chain, if whoever the final person that's putting it on shelf wants to use the seal, it's a 0.5% royalty of the wholesale price to use the seal. But with that, you unlock all of the data that we measure at the farm. So let's think about all of the stakeholders in the supply chain. So you've got the farmer who wants to make a profit, and the data for him or her is going to make the farm more profitable. But what about the person who's buying from the farm, the supermarket? What do they care about? Well, in their boardroom, they're under tremendous pressure to answer the question, are you sustainable? What is your carbon footprint? What effect are you having on the local economy? And with Regenified, you can start to answer those questions, because I can tell you the exact carbon footprint of a steak that comes from a Regenified farm. Why can I tell you that? Because I've measured it. It's not going off a spreadsheet. A lot of carbon capture is done via a small experiment somewhere, and then you work out the weight of the piece of meat, and then you reference this experiment, and that's how you get the number. But for us, it's the actual data coming from the actual farm. So it's very appealing to corporate businesses who have to write ESG supports. They have to write ESG reports, and they'll be very focused on what's called scope 3 emissions. That's the upstream emissions of producing whatever it is before it gets to your store or your butcher shop or whatever it is. And then finally, let's think about the consumer, who ultimately is going to pull it through the supply chain. What do they care about? Well, they know now that the certification is talking about nutrient density. And what's really exciting about the nutrient density piece is that it goes hand in hand with flavor. So if an apple, a loaf of bread, a steak, if they come from a regenerative farm, not only are they going to be more nutrient dense, they're going to be more flavorful. And so when you start talking to chefs and the world that you're from, this is really attractive, because suddenly you've got a food ingredient to work with that has naturally much more flavor. So then you can start to really do some pretty magical stuff from a chef point of view, or from, somebody picking up the product in the supermarket and taking it home. So the purpose of getting all this data during the verification is really to appeal to all of the different stakeholders in the supply chain for all of their different needs, because everyone has a slightly different lens on what they'll care about.
And so how many farms do you have? How many farmers do you have in your network?
Right now, we're growing, and we probably have about 1.7 million acres mostly across the US. We are international. We have some down in South America. We're also in the UK and Europe. In fact, quite excitingly, one of the main supermarkets in the UK called Waitrose, which to our American listeners, I guess would be something similar to kind of Wegmans or Whole Foods. They recently announced that by 2035, they want to convert their whole supply chain over to regenerative agriculture for the fresh produce. So I'm talking milk, eggs, meat. Mm-hmm. They've got 352 stores. So obviously the supply chain to feed into them is quite complex. And your average farm size in the UK is much smaller than the farm size here in the US. But we're busy out on the farms in the UK right now getting that verified. It's going to take time. And obviously in the beef world, a key part of Regenified is looking at the whole life of the animal. So we're not just interested in the last 100 days, 150 days, it's the life of the animal. And oftentimes that animal will have 3 different homes on its journey from being born to being slaughtered. So you have the cow-calf farms, which are the mummy and baby ones where the animal's born. And then often you'll have backgrounders, which are the next stop along the journey. And then you'll have finishers, which get the animal ready for slaughter. So it's quite complicated because every single step has to be verified to make sure that they're operating regenerative practices. But when it ends up as being a piece of meat with that stamp on, you know that all that hard work has been done for you. And so it's really exciting. There's a lot of potential out there. We've got many, many farmers in the network who are very willing and able to farm this way. And they're starting to understand how they can do things better for themselves, for their families, for the next generation. Because that's another huge thing, which I'm particularly passionate about. I know you had Jeff on from Shake Shack. Well, his head of sustainability, Corey Blumenthal, she posted something on her LinkedIn recently, which said that over the last 5 years, 75 farms per day have gone out of business. 75 farms per day over the last 5 years. That's not acceptable. The average age of a US farmer is 68 years old, something in that region. That's not acceptable. I know countless farmers' kids who have no interest in going back to the family farm because they just don't see the appeal of that lifestyle because they work very hard for very low profits. Well, we're trying to reverse that process by educating the farmer and making farming exciting again so that the next generation will want to farm, they'll want to produce nutritious food, and it's something that you can have profit, and maybe, just maybe, you can take a vacation every once in a while too.
Yeah, and it sounds like that you are trying to make it more purposeful for those farmers. Not that they don't have a purpose today, but I would argue that particularly the younger people, we all want purpose in what we do, right? I mean, you moved from the UK to the United States, right? For it, we all want purpose in what we do, but the more purposeful we can become, the more authentic we can become, I think that's more attractive.
Absolutely. And the thing to think about as well, I said at the start that we're founded by farmers. There are 3 farmers, Gabe Brown, Alan Williams, and Doug Peterson, and they've spent their career both as farmers. And so as well as their other jobs, Alan Williams was also a decorated scientist. Doug Peterson worked for the NRCS, which is the National Resource Conservation Service, all his career. But the point is that they've designed Regenified to benefit the farmer. That's our primary goal. Our goal is to turn all supply chains regenerative, sure, but it's got to benefit the farmer. That's where it starts with. And if it eventually benefits the consumer, that's great. That's really great. But ultimately, this thing is designed to make a farmer more profitable so they can produce food to feed this country.
Yeah, and I think it's just trickled down to the consumer. You get more nutrient-dense food. You get a more purposeful buy. If you are a grocery store, there's a reason Shake Shack has a great brand, right?
Absolutely.
Because they're incredibly culinary and purpose-focused in how they source and prepare and serve their food. Right?
And I would encourage all brands out there to be more thoughtful, because better solutions are out there and it doesn't have to be out of budget. These are things that can be affordable. I mean, right now, regenerative products do tend to be more expensive, and that's purely because of scarcity. There aren't that many of them around yet. So there's a very high demand and not enough supply yet. But you can produce food for a much lower cost on the farm, and eventually that will start to trickle through. And so with a brand like a Shake Shack or a Chipotle, these are supply chains, these are companies that are very thoughtful about where they get their ingredients from. And I'd encourage all brands out there to do that, because it makes a massive difference in terms of the future of farming in this country, in terms of climate change, in terms of annual temperature rises, in terms of natural disasters. All of these things will be affected by it. And by being more thoughtful, it doesn't necessarily have to cost more.
And, I don't think it's when you look at these brands, Chipotle, Cava, Shake Shack. These are some of the best brands, not just restaurant brands, some of the best brands in the country. I mean, you can change your brand, right? I agree with you.
They've been very good at sticking to their principles as they've grown, and that's what's impressed me. Shake Shack started out as a burger shack in New York, but even though it's grown to how many shacks there are out there right now, they've stayed true to their original values. And same with Chipotle, and I think that's really important and something that's difficult to do on a practical level, but they've achieved it.
Yeah. Great. So what are your biggest challenges at Regenified?
I think the biggest challenge is the education piece, helping the farmer understand that this is very possible. With a few tweaks to the way that they're farming, we can really help improve their livelihood, their profitability. It's an education piece with brands, helping them understand that all of these complex questions, which they're trying to find the answer to, we can help them with that. The answer exists, and the answer is practical, and the answer can be rolled out into your brands. And then finally, talking to the consumer and really helping. I often think about the shopper with maybe two screaming kids in a shopping cart with 0.1 second to decide which pack of meat to put in the shopping cart. And there in front of you is a wall of meat with all different types of claims and complexity. And a big part of our job in that is to try to get that confidence across the consumer that we've done the hard work, so that you just need to look for that seal and that comes from a supply chain with the values that we stand for, that we've talked about on this podcast. But that's the biggest challenge. But that's where I've been really impressed with the work that Gabe, our founder, has done. He's in an amazing documentary called Kiss the Ground, which I know something like 10 million plus people have already seen. There's a follow-up to that called Common Ground, which will be out streaming soon. They're making a third one. My friends over in the UK have a documentary called 6 Inches of Soil. There are more and more ways for people to understand and become educated on this topic. But that's the biggest challenge, is the education piece. Because once people understand it, this all makes sense. But it just takes a long time, and there are a lot of systems, and we definitely won't get into politics, but there are a lot of subsidies and things which are not helpful yet. But with time, hopefully we'll be able to redress that balance.
Yeah, and there's actually based in Austin, there's a chain called Hop Dotty, which I guess you're familiar with, and the CEO Jeff Chandler, I believe, saw the movie Kiss the Ground. And they've now switched the majority or all of their burgers to regenerative.
That's right. And just quickly, before I won't get into politics, I promise. But I was on I went on a vacation to Uruguay this summer with my family. And here in the States, grass-fed beef is more expensive than corn-fed beef because it takes a little bit longer for the animal to go from birth to slaughter. Well, guess what? In Uruguay, I went to the stores. The premium, the most expensive beef in there was corn-fed meat. And I said, why is that? Why is corn-fed beef more expensive than grass-fed beef? And the response was simple. Well, corn is expensive. So if we're going to feed corn to the animals, we need a higher price for it. And it's at a premium. And then I started really thinking about that. And it made me realize that the reason corn-fed beef, one of the reasons is so cheap in the US, is because of subsidies. It's made artificially cheap by the subsidies. And therefore, it kind of skews the market upside down. I thought that was quite an interesting thing to think about, the role that policy can play in our choices of which food we choose to eat.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's lean into the consumer a little bit as we kind of wind this down. I get that you've got this labeled and they've got a half a second or a second to make that meat choice, right? But at the same time, I believe, maybe incorrectly, that as consumers, we want to connect with the food. right? Okay, that's regenerative, but why? What am I doing? How do I feel great about myself today? Let's get a little narcissistic here, right? By buying this beef, right? Maybe I'm helping
Sure.
this farm. How does Regenified connect with the consumer?
Well, we're really working on that. I think farmers, every single farmer in our network has an amazing, unique story, which is very engaging if the consumer was to understand it. So we're working on ways. One brand that we work with is called Vital Farms Eggs, and I don't know if you've ever purchased one of their eggs, but when you open the carton, inside is a little card, and it tells you which farm it's come from, some statistics about the farm, and a story to really help engage you and feel good about buying those eggs. And we're working on exactly the same for all of the other food products and brands that we work with, because on each verification we take photos and get the story of the farmer so that we can help to use those stories to really connect with the brands, but ultimately connect with the consumer. I don't want people to ever be eating a faceless steak with a supermarket stamp on it. I really want them to think, when they're eating a burger, I often think about this, and it's probably me being kind of too much in the meat space, but that burger, when I eat it, that's taken 3 years to get from birth to the plate or wherever it is that I'm enjoying it. And that's probably come through maybe 3 separate farming families, and they've worked really hard to give that animal the best welfare possible so that eventually I can sit there and eat my burger in the airport or whatever. And I think I urge people to really try to understand where your food comes from and strive for learning that, because we're definitely going to try to make that information available to people that we work with, and that will be through things like Vital Farms are doing, or through QR codes on products. We're doing some experimenting with that, where you can point your phone at the QR code and up will pop a video of the farm that it comes from or story. And I think we can do, as an industry, we can do a much better job in making that connection, because the more connected the consumer feels to the farmer, the more it protects that farmer narrative, and the more it makes the consumer feel really good about buying the food and really connecting with them and helping them understand the choices that they've made in the store really do make a difference to the farming community that are ultimately trying to give the consumer what they want. And as I said before, I definitely don't blame farmers for going down the kind of monoculture, single crop, high input farming, because that's what we've been asking for. But now hopefully we're going to start to reverse that and really help those consumers understand the differences available to them when they're shopping.
Yeah, and my family spent some time in Europe this summer, and when you're in Italy, you eat more purposefully. The meal is more important, right? And the food is more important, and the in our family, the meal is more important, right?
Yeah.
It feels like that pendulum has swung so far. I like to say we're kind of on a race to the bottom. How cheap can we produce food, and how cheap can we sell it for, right?
Yeah.
And we're losing kind of that provenance, the holiness of that food. Eating together as a society, as a family, as friends, whatever we may do, is one of the most culturally, socially impactful things we do, right?
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
it feels like we're just at a race to the bottom. And what I would point out is, if you look at the ads right now for a lot of the restaurants, what are they featuring? Sauces to cover up what? Food that needs a sauce, right?
Exactly. If you ever get to enjoy a steak with me in a restaurant, you'll notice that I don't put any sauce or anything on my meat. I really want to taste the meat by itself. And if it comes from an animal that's had really good welfare, and it's come from a farm or farms that have practiced regenerative agriculture, you can really taste it, and you shouldn't need to put sauce on steak. And certainly if I walk into a steakhouse and it has a bottle of A1 steak sauce on the table, I'm probably walking straight out before enjoying what it has to offer.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, folks. I'm a huge hot sauce fan, so I'm the first. I'm a Cholula guy. I love this stuff. It's always in my fridge. Okay, so I'm not bashing sauces. I do. Okay, so, but I do think it's important that we recognize as an industry, as food service, grocery, farmers, distribution, that this race to the bottom isn't healthy for a lot of reasons. It's not healthy for us as individuals. It's not healthy for our planet. It's not healthy for farming, the farming industry, as Richard, you just talked about, right? And so we need that pendulum to swing. So before we kind of say where does Regenified going to be in a decade from now, and how will farming improve? I want us to click back here for a second. Of those 1.7 million acres, all of those are carbon neutral or better, I would assume.
Yeah, carbon negative, and quite strongly so.
Yeah. And by carbon negative, meaning that soil is capturing more carbon than it's emitting.
Exactly.
So it is helping the planet. Right?
Exactly.
Okay. Great. So where is Regenified going to be in a decade from now, and how will farming and how will the consumer or consumption improve? Like, what does success look like?
Well, Gabe Brown and Alan Williams have a sister company called Understanding Ag, and they're consultants, and they work with brands and with farmers really as the kind of education piece. And they've currently been to 36 million acres across the world. Now, remember, we've verified 1.7 million. So we're still really small, but the potential is huge, because the people that have expressed an interest in Understanding Ag, that 36 million acres, those are people who are realizing, hey, we probably can do this better. We want to do this better. They'll put some of these practices in place, and then they'll pick up the phone to Regenified and say, hey, I think we're ready. Come and verify our property. Let us know where we are on the journey, and let's start to plug into these supply chains. And we definitely do feel like pioneers out there at the moment. In 10 years' time, I'm hoping that regenerative will be much more mainstream. I think there's a huge education piece to be done, but that will happen. There's marketing dollars available behind this movement. And once all the different stakeholders involved really start to understand how this can benefit them, it will start to move. And I know it'll start to move, because it makes sense. You know, I've been in this industry for 20 plus years, from working on farms, working in slaughterhouses, all the way through to working in chef's kitchens and butcher shops. I understand how it works. And I also understand that this vision of turning a supply chain regenerative is real, it's practical, and it is definitely scalable. And so in 10 years' time, I think it will be commonplace to have regenerative food, period, available in most restaurants and supermarkets.
Yeah. So, Richard, thank you very much. I want to thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time. It's been really interesting and very engaging to talk to you. Thank you so much.
And that brings us to the end of another insightful journey through the fields of innovation on Farm to Fork, the Innovators. It's an honor to have you listen. If you found today's episode as fascinating as we did, don't forget to share it with a friend, write a review, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another episode. Farm to Fork is not just a podcast. It's a community of forward thinkers and change makers. Your thoughts and ideas matter to us. Reach out on social media or through our website, datumfs.com, and be a part of the ongoing conversation. As we wrap up today, remember, the future of the food supply chain is in our hands. Stay curious, stay innovative, and let's continue growing together. Until next time, this is David Maloney signing off from Farm to Fork, the Innovators. Thank you for being a part of this community. See you in the next episode.